great to be here in Salt Lake City and Utah, actually. But it's great to be in Utah, and I have heard so much about the Revolutionary Student Union, and I was like so anxious to be here, and I have to say I'm more than impressed by what you all do. And for anybody who's not in the group, please get involved with it, because when you know things are going on and wrong in this country and the world, but you know you can change it, you got to do it. And it's always the greatest opportunity to get involved when you're in school, to study like the RSU does, because then afterwards, you know basically what you're for. And then when you go to work after you finish school, then that'll be another great experience, like union organizing. I have been to Cuba 49 times, but you don't, and I never thought that would happen, but you don't have to do that in order to understand where you stand on the Cuban Revolution. I'm assuming that everybody here has a basic sense of, I don't know, support for Cuba's right to exist and have its sovereignty respected. But I would like to do this. I'll give a few minutes of a little bit of introduction, very, very brief. There's a lot to say about Cuba. I think I'd like to talk about the contemporary situation, a little bit of background, and take questions and have a lot of discussion. Because there's been a lot of news about Cuba lately. Probably some of you, I think the thing that really kind of shook people in the movement was a quote that traveled around the world. AP and all the mass media covered it, saying Fidel said, the Cuban model of socialism doesn't even work for Cuba. And of course the media wants everyone to hear that, to be like, yeah, we were always right, Cuba doesn't work. But in fact, I knew exactly what he was referring to. And I was not surprised to see the announcement, I think it was yesterday, that the government announced that they're going to be eliminating 500,000 jobs out of roughly 5 million jobs that are provided by the state, because most employment is state employment. But it's something that was coming and that they've been discussing for quite a long time in Cuba, and it's not a shock to people. It's going to be hard, but it's either that or collapse economically, and I will explain why that is. So, has anybody here ever been to Cuba? Who would be interested? I'm not proposing a trip, but who would want to go to Cuba? That's usually the response. Most people want to go, at least out of curiosity. No matter what they think about it, they're curious about what is taking place there, and they hear healthcare and education are free, which they are. But basically, the Cuban Revolution has had such a profound effect on the world and in Latin America, and also in the U.S., that it's hard to believe it's only 51 years old. Most people here are probably less than half that age. But in social phenomena and in history, 50 years is a very short amount of time, especially for what Cuba has accomplished in the world and Latin America, from their revolutionary outlook toward helping people, from military assistance in the African revolutions of the 70s, to right now having 28,000 medical doctors around the world, quite a number of countries, especially the 14,000 who operate in Venezuela providing free health care, in Bolivia and Nicaragua. There are 3 countries in this hemisphere that have eliminated their long-standing illiteracy, and that's Cuba in the 3rd year of the revolution, Venezuela due to Cuban teachers, and Bolivia, which happened just 2 years ago. And that's the internationalism Cuba feels, but also that they have resisted U.S. imperialist designs on them for so long. When the Soviet Union collapsed and basically cut off the aid with Cuba in 1990, up until that point, Cuba imported $88.3 billion, about 83% of everything that it depended on in trade came from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. $8.3 billion. They relied on everything for the raw materials for food production, steel, wood, tires, tractors for the farms, insecticides, pesticides, everything that they needed for agriculture. And within 2 years, that 8.3 billion dropped to only a little more than $2 billion. It was already a country suffering from shortages and from the U.S. blockade. But with its main trading partner gone, the U.S. quickly moved in to try to do away with Cuba once and for all. And they bragged about it at that time. So in 1992, in November, Bush Sr. signed a law called Torricelli. And basically it tightened the U.S. blockade, the economic blockade against Cuba very severely. Because Cuba no longer could purchase or trade for the food and raw materials from the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. For example, they used to import most of their milk for the kids from Germany, East Germany. And since they could no longer do that, they had to find new places to buy food and medicine. So they went to the Latin American market, which they hadn't done in many years. And the biggest companies they bought from in the very next year after the Soviet Union collapsed was U.S. subsidiaries in these countries, which are really companies of that country. For example, if there was a U.S. company operating by Argentinian capitalists in Argentina is an Argentinian company. But the Torricelli law said any third country subsidiary directed against Latin America is now prohibited from trading with Cuba. So in the first year before Torricelli took effect, Cuba had purchased about almost $1 billion worth of food, very essential stuff, almost $1 billion worth of food from Latin American companies. The very next year, because of Torricelli, it dropped down to 1.6 million. In other words, the faucet was completely turned off. This is what the U.S. blockade is about, not just a ban of trade between countries, but trying to internationalize a blockade against Cuba. And so Cuba had to engage in some very strategic changes in their economy. It was before this, what they call now the special period. The special period that they refer to is the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's really basically almost a war footing on how to survive in a new world, and basically a capitalist world, while maintaining socialism. And the reason I mention this little bit of history is because it has very much to do with what is going on today. It's really a continuation. And they had to find new sources of income, new sources of food, new countries to trade with. And so they did things that they had never imagined they would have to do, because they had a socialist camp before, it no longer existed. And what they did was essentially develop tourism as a source of income. It was a very, very minor part of their economy. They didn't really have international tourism before, it was only national. And so they built thousands of hotel rooms because they said we have the sun and the beach, and we can, exploit that for income. And then they also opened up the country in a very controlled way, but they opened up the country to foreign investment. Something, again, that they said at that time they never imagined they would have to do. And the purpose of the foreign investment, it would allow essentially 49% ownership of the profits of any investment of that company from abroad, and even up to 100% in any strategic industry that Cuba couldn't operate. But it never really reached 100%. Foreign investment, and then because food was such a dire shortage, they decided to break up the state farms, which were socialist state farms, because the state could no longer provide tractors, oil, anything to run the farms with. They broke them up into cooperatives, and the people who used to be the workers of the farm were still the workers, but they were now the owners of any production that they made, while the land still is in the hands of the state. That was a very big move. But to give an incentive to the farmers to grow and work harder, because basically if you don't have tractors, you're just going to have to get your oxen and work a hell of a lot harder to produce food. It was all about reality. And what they did was, they said to the farmers, anything over the quota that you're required to produce for the state, for the rationed food, for the population, for the schools, for the seniors, everything that was provided to the state. They said anything you produce over that, you can bring to market. Farmers markets are going to be opened up, and you can charge any price that you want for it. It was basically going back to individual incentive. And they described all these changes. They were very frank about it. It wasn't like China, which said at one point, it's good to be rich. We'll have socialism with Chinese characteristics, market socialism. The Cubans said very openly, we are not building socialism. We have to be frank about this. That's one thing, is that they were very honest about the stage. They said, we're using capitalist-style reforms in order to preserve the socialist gains and survive to a point where we can then restore. It doesn't mean that they got rid of healthcare. Healthcare, education was all maintained free. But these were the things they did to survive. And it did help them survive. Tourism became and is still the #1 source of income in the country. The nickel mines. Cuba is second or third producer of nickel in the world. They have one of the largest resources of nickel in the world. It's a very strategic metal. And the mines seized up in the time of the special period, the early part. And so mainly Canadian corporations, Sherritt Corporation came in and started up all the nickel mines. They're all operating at full operation. Nickel is now become the #2 source of income in Cuba. And it used to draw a very high price, but I'll talk about that later. So basically, Cuba not only survived the 1990s and U.S. intensification of aggression against Cuba. By the way, who's ever heard of the Helms-Burton Law? The Helms-Burton Law was Clinton's baby. That was 1996. He signed a law in March, which is very, very severe against Cuba. It says that any corporation in the world that trades with Cuba or with any Cuban entity that used to be U.S. owned those executives of that company shall be prohibited from entering the United States, and they can be sued at any time in the future by any U.S. citizen. That is another big internationalization of the blockade. And it's a violation of international law, it's a violation of many other countries' laws, but it has a very severe effect on Cuba. Interestingly, Sherritt, which is, I think, the biggest investor in Cuba, this Canadian firm that does nickel mining, they got a letter, all their executives got a letter from the U.S. Treasury Department saying, you and your families are no longer allowed to enter the U.S. And so immediately the Sherritt board voted to have their next meeting in Havana, which is, I think, a pretty nice response. But anyway, so since then, the productive capacity in Cuba, because of the lack of resources, dropped very drastically by 34%. That's like major depression of a scale we've never experienced, not even during the Great Depression in the U.S. And yet there was some layoffs. For the first time in the revolution, there were layoffs. But everybody who was laid off at the time in the 90s was kept 60% of their income until they were placed into a new job. Most jobs were still state-owned, still state-run, but they also allowed self-employment. They had a rule that you could not employ somebody else and exploit somebody, but you could become like a plumber, go fix people's houses. You could rent a room or your apartment out. You could become a taxi driver, but you had the license for it. You had to get a license, and you had to pay taxes for it. Why taxes? Cubans don't pay taxes for anything of any sort. But if you're self-employed, you pay taxes because the government still has to provide free health care, all the social services people are accustomed to. So you can't just make your own money and then not contribute to society. And they also said, we're not doing this so people become capitalists. We're doing this so you can become employed because the state cannot provide employment for everyone. So those are the basic things. So from until 1996, it was basically survival mode. And then, because of tourism, the nickel mining, Cuba started to have an increase in their economy. And for the first time in 1996, after 6 years of very hard sacrifice. For example, caloric intake of Cubans went from 2,500 a day calories to 1,500, and everybody lost weight. It was just survival. So in 1996, things started to improve. Actually, in 2000, 2001, 2002, the economy grew at a very strong rate, even 10, 11%. Things were looking up. But they've never reached the level of pre-Soviet collapse, not yet. So what has happened since 2008? What's happened in the world since September 2008? Pardon? The economic crisis, the financial economic crisis, which is also basically a capitalist crisis. It's affected Cuba and every other oppressed country. But to give you an idea of how severe it is for Cuba, nickel ore was drawing a price of $50,000 a ton as of September 2008. And within a few months, it dropped to between 9 and 10,000. Now, 50% of Cuba's foreign income, 50% for the whole country, comes from nickel. So if the price of nickel drops by 80%, or 75%, 80%, what do you think it does for their purchasing ability for food, everything that they supply to the population? It's a very drastic crisis. But we don't read about that in the news. All we read is 500,000 workers were laid off, or are going to be laid off. But a country like Cuba, which gets no credit in the world, they get no loans from any banks. The U.S. sees to that. In fact, right now, European banks are being fined by the United States for accepting Cuban money in their banks or in the transactions. The price of food as of 2008, and even before that, the year before, with biofuels and the corn skyrocketing, even in Mexico and so on, the biofuels has created an increase in food price. For Cuba, for example, I think that the price of milk to import increased 3 times, and they guarantee for every child up to the age of 7 a liter of milk every day for like pennies. But everything they've had to import, rice and all the essential foods, they import 60% of the food has gone up 2, 3, 4 times, and this is with a limited income. Tourism has been affected worldwide. Their tourism, I think, increased by, I think they said something like 3% over the last year. But the amount that the tourists are spending has gone down by 13%. So in every economic sector, they're being hit very hard. So they also have this problem, which is a problem kind of unique to them as a socialist country. And that is, through all the difficulties, Cuba has never cut down on their healthcare services or schooling. In all the time of the special period, they kept creating more classrooms. They never shut down a classroom. They never had to pay for university. In fact, all university students get a stipend, so they don't have to work. So kids in Cuba do not work when they go to college. So it would be nice to have here. I think just about everybody here probably works. But anyway, but they can't. They have found now, and they're talking about this at length. People say Cuba, there's no freedom or discussion or opinion. They're a very opinionated people, and they're discussing it in the media, everywhere, in the workplace, that they cannot keep providing all of these services if the production does not meet the needs. And one problem is, one of the measures of the special period in the early 90s was, for the first time, they allowed Cubans to get money from abroad. There's a large percentage of Cubans, not a large percentage, a considerable amount of people who have family members in Miami and other parts of the U.S. and other countries. And it used to be, before 1993, that Cubans could not have possession of any foreign currency. And that's true in a lot of countries, to protect their very weak economies. Cubans were not allowed to own dollars. It was against the law. And Fidel, in his speech in changes so people can survive. And now we're going to let Cubans send money to their families in Cuba. And they also said it's going to create some inequality. I mean, they were frank about it. But they said if 1 million people can get money from their families to take care of their essentials, it's 1 million people who will be able to make it through this period. And they said we also know that Cubans will share with each other. But what is created now, in some instances, enough to cause some problems is that a lot of Cubans, if you get enough money from your family, you just don't go to work. There used to be a law in Cuba before 1993 that all males over the age of 18 had to work. They had to either be in the military, the police, or be at work. Now that's not required. And, you know, frankly, it's not a consumer society. People don't go spend the weekend shopping like we do here. They don't buy a lot of consumer items. I mean, they'd like to have more. It'd be nice to have more, but they don't. And so they stated a statistic this year that there's 189,000 people, mostly young people, who are neither in school or working. And at the same time, if you're getting all the services, which is very costly, healthcare is free, but it's expensive to get the equipment, for the medicine, everything you have to provide, the training of medical doctors. It's not like out of the air. Neither is schooling, neither is the housing they have to provide, neither is everything else that people get. And the workers who are in productive work are saying, you know, if there's going to be cutbacks, people have to all go to work. They've been exhorting people. Everyone has to go to work and help build up the economy and grow food. And that's not happening. And they're reaching a point now, which is what happened with this announcement yesterday, that the economy could collapse if they don't make some drastic changes. And the state can no longer provide for what they consider to be inflated work forces in factories that are running at a huge deficit. I mean, that's the basics of economics in the country right now. What they're going to do is allow people to have more self-employment, and they're urging more and more people to go into the fields. They want more people to go into agriculture because there's a great underuse of land, and the cost of food is too high in the world. They're concerned about the blockade getting increased, and they frankly feel that they have to be able to become self-sufficient in food. They're also working to eliminate as much as they can any medicines that they import. You know, they're very famous for their biotechnology and medicine, and they're working on developing medicines that they no longer have to get from other countries. So basically, with the announcement yesterday of 500,000 layoffs is going to take place starting next year, they're going to shut down a lot of operations that they cannot sustain any longer. But I think for us in the United States, it's very, very important to know the role of the United States government in trying to bring down Cuba. While Cuba, on the other hand, has never diminished its solidarity with other peoples who need more help, like, you know, the assistance they give all over the world. I was in New Orleans 6 days after Katrina, and we were there trying to help people there. I made a film that intended to give a message that the people were heroes and not looters, because it was a very dangerous message that was going out. And we were helping some of our friends who set up the Common Grounds, you know, collective there. And we made it into downtown. We made it past the police guards and everything into downtown New Orleans. And I got a phone call from one of my media friends, you know, one of my journalist friends in Cuba, and he said, Gloria, I know you're in New Orleans, because I told him I was going to New Orleans, and they said, we are right now in the convention center in Havana. He said, there's 1,100 doctors here in the convention center. Those doctors had each 35 pounds of medicine strapped onto 2 backpacks, each one of them, 1,100 doctors. And they were all prepared. They were like this force that was, right when Katrina hit, Fidel Castro sent a secret message to Bush and said, we have these 1,100 doctors, including psychiatrists. We have 3 mobile hospitals. We can make it into New Orleans in 5 hours as soon as you give us permission. We just want to help. And he gave a secret message to Bush so that Bush wouldn't feel like, you know, save me some face if I let you come in. Well, it never happened. And so on that 6th day, Fidel made this public announcement. We are offering the people of New Orleans the assistance that they need. We can make it in 5 hours. And we urge the people to tell their government, let us in. And that's really a tragedy. That's just symptomatic of what we don't know about Cuba. And how we, even in the left, people go, yeah, well, they're really unhappy and this and that. Well, they're struggling. But I'll tell you, I think the more we learn about them, the more that we challenge the blockade and the travel ban and go for ourselves, I think that it will give us the kind of tools and information for our own struggle here, because I think we need to defeat the system that has brought so much misery and genocide in the world, which is capitalism in the United States. So I'm going to end it there for questions. I'm sorry if I talk too long. But I want to give you some background.
Right here.
Yeah, let's give her a hand first.
Any type paper there on that table, yeah, that stuff. Maybe that stuff too. I don't know. And I'll tell you why it's a blockade, because, again, the Helms-Burton Law gives the U.S. the power to sue corporations for anything that they're investing in Cuba. And the U.S., thanks to Clinton, there's also all of Cuba's assets that are being frozen by the United States Treasury have been seized by a number of lawsuits that are extremely outrageous, if you heard, but I'll mention them. And the other is, here's one measure, for example. All telephone conversations and calls, the communications between the U.S. and Cuba, AT&T gets their part of the revenue, and Cuba's share of the revenue is frozen by the United States. The United States seizes all the money that Cuba is entitled to from the phone calls and held in U.S. banks. So it's really interesting that Cuba still allows the communications, even though they don't get any money from it. And due to the law that Clinton signed, there has been a spate of these lawsuits. That's why I say blockade, to give you an idea of how damaging it is to Cuba. There have been a number of lawsuits allowing U.S. citizens to sue Cuba, and some of them by some of these families of, for example, CIA pilots who were flying over Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 2007, 3 years ago, $91 million of Cuba's assets was awarded to families of 2 CIA agents who flew over Cuba and were shot down. An act of self-defense by Cuba, right? Another man, Howard, in 2007, the family of Robert Fuller was awarded $400 million. In May 2007, a Miami-Dade circuit judge awarded an admitted CIA agent who is still alive, Gustavo Villaldo. He brags that he helped capture Che Guevara to be killed. He was awarded $1 billion recently, 3 years ago. Why? Because he claimed without any evidence or proof in a Miami court, he goes into court, judge hears and says, I award you $1 billion. Because he said, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara made my father commit suicide. That's all he had to say. No evidence, no proof. This is not an exaggeration. Why did he say he committed suicide? His father was one of those very wealthy people in Cuba who got his property confiscated, and he couldn't take the idea, couldn't stand the idea of living, as a worker, so he killed himself. So now, 50 years later, Cuba's assets are, $1 billion judgment. And on, 21 million, 253 million, 138 million, 1.5 million, and here's a new one. This is Cuba's assets, and they've already now seized everything that's in the New York banks recently. Now they're going after the money that Cuba has in European banks. That's why it's a blockade. It's an economic war. And this is harmful. We're talking about Cuba's nickel income being reduced. Well, this is another blow to them. And it's a small country. another big one though. In Miami court in February of this year, I said that there are 14,000 Cuban medical doctors in Venezuela, right? And they volunteer to go. They go for 2 years at a time. Sometimes they stay longer. I know many of those people there because I've met them in Venezuela and I knew them in Cuba. They go for 2 years, voluntary. Well, 7 of these people and 1 nurse who served in the international mission in Venezuela have now defected to the U.S. They're now in Miami, and they have a $450 million lawsuit against Cuba and Venezuela's oil company, PDVSA. And they're suing because they said they were reduced to slavery in Venezuela for having to work there. That's just bullshit. And it's part of a class action suit. And it will allow any other Cuban doctor who wishes to join it for the price of $50 million each. And why is this possible? Because George Bush in August 2006 signed a law that, as I say here, probably nobody in the U.S. even knows about, called the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Act. For any Cuban doctor serving in these Cuban missions abroad who defects to the U.S. will be entitled to be part of this lawsuit. What is this? What do you think this? What do you think about hearing about that? I'd like to know someone's comment about that. You see, the U.S. government is using everything they can to bring Cuba down. I classify it as 1,000 arrows aimed at Cuba, things we don't even know about. And you know, there's many other things. I've written a whole document about the things that Cuba's facing with the U.S. So that's the blockade. What is Cuba's trade? They have more relations with countries around the world than at any time in their history since the revolution. Because a lot of countries have received assistance from Cuba and over time have said, you know what, we're not going to play the U.S. game anymore. For example, the Organization of American States, which is dominated by the U.S., all the Latin American and all the Western Hemispheric countries, including Canada and the U.S., they expelled Cuba in 1962 for being Marxist-Leninists. That's why they kicked them out. And this year, at their summit, they said, we removed that stipulation, and you're welcome to apply. And Cuba said, well, we're not really interested anymore. They did. But last October, in which has become a yearly ritual for the last 18 years, in the largest vote ever at the United Nations General Assembly, a vote every October on the question of whether the U.S. should lift the U.S. blockade, and they call it a blockade. And this last year, 183 countries voted in favor of Cuba, and 3 voted against. And I want to ask you for extra credit. Who are the 3 countries?
U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia.
Good guess. Good guess. Anybody else want to guess? U.S. and Israel is right. Who else?
Colombia.
Good guess. No, Palau. Palau is an island of 40,000 people, like 10,000 miles away from Cuba. I think it's exactly 10,000.
That's my next guess.
I want to go to Palau, and I want to go talk to all the people, and I bet you next year they turn in favor of Cuba. But actually the thing is that Palau is right now pleading for the U.S. to aid it with $15 million. They're in complete dependency on the U.S. government. That's the only reason. And you asked about
the travel ban, the bill in the House to relieve the travel ban.
you know how like when the House and the Senate have to reconcile bills and they have to change the language, and the 2 bills are identical in the House and the Senate to lessen the restrictions on U.S. agribusiness selling food to Cuba, very restrictive, and also to allow basic lifting the travel ban, that is, not enforcing the travel ban on Americans. And it would seem that it could pass, but in fact, the Obama administration, I think, has let the Democrats know in both houses, don't even bring it to my table. The same thing that happened with Bush 3 years ago. It was the same bill 3 years ago under Bush. another issue to show how the Democrats and Republicans are cowards when it comes to standing up for what's right. When the governors met in July in Boston, all the 50 governors of the country, and they met for their yearly conference, and at that time it was announced that the Obama administration was suing Arizona for that anti-immigrant law. There was a major New York Times article where 12 Democrat governors at the conference complained publicly, why is Obama doing this to us in this election year? He's making us look bad because we think the public wants tighter immigration and, you know, troops on the border and whatever. Why is he doing this? So you think they don't want an immigration, you know, justice? They don't want anything about Cuba coming before them. And there's rumors from people that we know who talk to congressmen that what may happen instead is Obama is, in fact, unnamed U.S. officials, I don't know if you read about this, about a month ago said, in 2 weeks, Obama is going to allow licensing for groups to go. That is limited licensing. And the purpose is not to give Americans the right to see Cuba for ourselves. The idea is a plan of destabilization. There's a big destabilization plan by Obama underway. Part of it, remember I told you that just now that Cubans are going to be allowed to have some self-employment? Well, Obama has just released $3 million in a pilot program that's going to be increased to bring $3 million secretly into Cuba to give money to individuals to become capitalists. They said we want. That's destabilization. When he said last year we'll let Cubans have cell phones, they're not letting them have medicine or food, but cell phones. What's cell phones for? Or equipment.
So they can hear their calls?
So they can hear from their Miami relatives and say, you know, we're having a good life here. You know, destabilization is what it's all about. And yet, if he lifts, if there's any lightening of the travel ban, it's actually good. No matter what the U.S. intentions are, the Cubans can handle it. We shouldn't be worried about whether Cuba can take the lifting of the blockade. Sometimes people go, yeah, but when the blockade's lifted, then all these companies are going to flood Cuba. No, they won't, because it's still a socialist country. And they determine who comes in to invest. I mean, they've cut off investments that they found were just not helpful to them. They have the power. So what we need to do is say, we've got to stop these restrictions on the Cubans and stop the restrictions on us. We have a right to go to Cuba.
That's very good.
I definitely realize that a lot of outside pressure that is trying to cause obviously destruction, but do you think as they bring capitalism into their infrastructure that it will kind of create another sort of demise? I know that you say that, I feel like there's got to be concern of like a limit or how far they're going to like, because I mean how much farther is the outside pressure going to force more capitalism until it becomes like a total counter-revolution?
You ask a very good question. And I think the best way to compare it to, or what their guide has been in all this, you know, I'm not one to criticize China in this talk by saying, China did this, but Cuba won't do that. They're different countries. And China has 1.3 billion people. And extreme underdevelopment that they felt required all the measures it took. I don't agree with, you know, billionaires and millionaires, but in Cuba, the whole capitalist reforms that they instituted, the maximum that they allowed anything in Cubans was they allowed home restaurants, but never more than 12 chairs. They allowed no exploitation of a person by another. That doesn't mean there wasn't violations. There's been plenty of it. Because once you open the door, other people will take advantage. They're going to open the door much more now among the Cubans. But I think their plan is so that people can employ themselves, not to become capitalists. However, it does generate desire for more. Once people have something, they want more. Not everybody, but some people do. But it's like the new economic policy in the early they would have not been able to survive had they not implemented the policy of developing the economy through allowing capitalist measures. And what Fidel said when they opened it up in '93 was exactly what Lenin said, that we know it will bring about inequality, but we have to fight ever more to keep the socialist consciousness alive, and to work in all the 50 years in Cuba of the solidarity that they've become accustomed to. You know, Cubans are a very unique kind of people. They've been steeled through so much struggle. And I've had 1,000 examples of the things they do for each other. So it's pretty hard to break that kind of unity and that solidarity. You should see my video someday. I have a half-hour documentary from that Workers' Congress in '96. And they were debating these problems. They were already developing. You know, farmers who would charge an arm and a leg for the food. And in this Congress, all these farmers got up and they just railed against those people. And they said, we revolutionary farmers, we got to stop this. And they said, how do we stop it? And the guy, and he got, in my video, he gets like, I showed one video. He got 5 standing ovations from all the people because he said, our doctors, our nurses, they're not getting a raise for who knows how long. We can't be gouging them. We have to all work together. And he said, so the way that we fight this is by more production. And that's like a very interesting point. It's a very political and conscious point made by a farmer. He says, you can't do it by policing people. You just have to grow more food to drive the price down. There just has to be more food. That's the problem. The problem with increase in prices is a shortage of food. And by the way, between 96 and 2008, every time that the economy grew and got stronger, socialist measures were brought back in. Very interesting. The party is extremely communist. It really is. And for example, the farmers' markets, I told you they could charge whatever they wanted. But then when the economy got stronger, the army came in with its own farms, its own market. They set up parallel markets to drive the price down. They charge much cheaper, and it forced the other farmers to drive their prices down. And then they said every last Sunday of the month, the state will set the prices in those markets. All that kind of stuff. But they're also coming back to a socialist norm that they had forgotten. They became a bit idealist, like I said. What is a socialist distribution? It's called from each according to their needs, from each according to their work, right? Communism is to each according to their needs, right? To their needs. Under socialism is you still have wages, to each according to your work. So if 189,000 people aren't working, but you're getting health care and housing, and because almost everyone owns their home, and you're getting free schooling, that's not to each according to your work. That's like to you regardless of what you're doing. So they're just bringing it back to, they have to incentivize people to work. But yeah, there's a problem. I'll be frank. You go to Cuba and you get into a taxi, a state-run taxi, and taxi drivers will turn off the meter. And you pay them $7 for the fare. They'll say, give me $7. And a lot of people who don't know will give them $7, not realizing they didn't have the meter on. And they put that money in their pocket. And $5, $7, $10 is a lot of money. And if you know people who get away with something like that, they'll do it all day long if they can. They have to bring some money back. But that's a giant drain. And in 2005, Fidel gave a speech, and I can send you all guys these links, but it's a speech that he gave, and he said, is the revolution going to collapse from within? And this is being honest among themselves in order to combat the problems. He said, we're facing a lot of corruption. And he said, this is our biggest challenge, we have to fight this. And then he spoke about the pilfering of gasoline. You know, gasoline is a great shortage. If you're you're a state worker, you can get a certain amount, but then the Cubans were suspecting, we're losing a lot of gas somewhere. Someone is paying someone off at the pump. And what they've developed since 2000 is this new work for youth who are playing a big role in helping fight the corruption. How many of you heard of the social workers in Cuba? This is, actually you can get a degree earning this. And what Cuba found out was they had to find a way to bring a lot of youth who were not participating in school or work to help fight the problems in the society. And so they've developed something called social workers. I think probably they have about 20,000 now. And what they do is they go out into the neighborhoods and see what problems people have, how can we help you, comments, and so forth. And one of the things they did was, after Fidel gave that speech, early one Monday morning, 10,000 social worker youth got the keys to all the gas stations. They became a force for 6 weeks. They monitored every drop of gasoline in the country. They took over they didn't drive the tankers or the trucks that delivered the gas, but they accompanied the workers who did. And they took over control of the gas pumps. They pumped every drop of gas for those 6 weeks. It's quite a thing to do. It was secret. Only the youth knew about it. And they found out after the end of 6 weeks that 55% of the gas was going to come stolen. That's a lot of money in the country. That's a lot of theft. But see, this is the things they're doing to combat it. And those youth social workers have become like heroes in Cuba. And they're doing all kinds of other deeds. And I did a video of these youth one night. We were just like, found a bunch of them in the street. And it's such an inspiring little piece I did of them. Because they're telling me, they said, remember I told you the 1.5 million people who've been cured of eye blindness? Have you heard about that? The Operation Miracle? Cuba's operating on. Their goal is to cure 6 million people in Latin America of blindness by operating on them in Cuba for free. And these it was 4 young men, and they said, yeah, Fidel would come to us every morning, early in the morning before we would, before we do our work. And he started to tell us what the plan was to take over these gas stations. And they said it was so great to be able to take care of every drop of that precious fluid. And then they said, and then we went on to the next task, which was to accompany these people, blind people, when they came off the planes from Latin America, from all these countries, to get operated on. So what is the purpose of that? What does it do? It sensitizes young people who perhaps weren't involved in being part of the revolution. They're firsthand seeing what their country is doing. We're helping solve problems, and we're also seeing what we're doing with other countries. That's a very living revolution. And these are the things, this is what you get when you go on a trip to Cuba. Not as a tourist, by the way.
Yeah, I'm really concerned, actually. I am not cool with 500,000 layoffs. And I know it's easy to say, well, it's a really poor country, and how can you judge? But I think you pointed out that there is quite a bit of corruption, something Fidel himself said, I'm really concerned that they are going to go down the Chinese route, which I don't consider a good thing at all. I think this is a counter-revolution. I think there's in the beginning stages of one. I don't know who's behind it. I don't know what exactly is the future for Cuba, but I know that, at least in my view, what real communists should be doing is fighting against this. Fighting for internationalizing the Cuban Revolution, fighting for, having them. Fidel said, when I said that, what I meant was the exact opposite of what I said. So I'm guessing what he meant was he's for not the Cuban model, but for the international model. I don't know. Maybe that's what he meant. Maybe he's meant something else. No one can decipher it.
How do you think Cuba should internationalize the revolution?
Well, I think first of all, Hugo Chavez made a call for the Fifth International. Have the Cuban Communist Party join it. They've had since the '60s. They've had the ability to start an international party based on their revolution. They haven't done it. I've been a huge supporter of Fidel Castro. Like I never said a single thing against him the entire time I've been a socialist until I found out about this, and I was just flabbergasted.
About the 500,000?
About the 500,000, and well, the first thing was when I first heard him say that, when he said, the Cuban model no longer works for us anymore. And then when I heard his explanation for it, it made absolutely no sense to me. And then when I heard the 500,000 people being laid off, that made complete sense to me with what he originally said. And so I feel totally betrayed, frankly.
But it's not your revolution.
But that's the thing, is it is. It's an international class, so it's everyone's revolution, you know. And that's, I guess maybe that's the difference between like my tendency and the PSL.
Then can you tell me, if it's your revolution, what are you doing here to fight the blockade and stuff? I really got to ask you that because, you know, we're really not doing enough in this country to stop U.S. policy.
Oh, I agree.
And I think to a large degree, it's really not the fault of the people who don't know, but we do know in this room. And that's why I think that it takes a lot of effort, but we got to let people know about it. I know, I hear what you're saying, but I got to tell you, you're taking one quote that the media flew around the world with from a right-winger, Jeffrey Goldberg. You're taking it from a man who is like a conspiracy theorist and a blatant right-winger Zionist. And I knew when people called me the other day and said, Gloria, what did he say? I said, I know exactly what Fidel's saying because they're having to go through some big changes that they've been announcing actually for 2 years now. Actually since 2007. Raul said this. They said, we are not going to be able to sustain 1 million. We have 1 million jobs in excess. Actually, they said 1 million jobs. And Fidel also said recently to the Venezuelan media, some of the media said to him, well, what do you really mean by socialism, Fidel? They said, I mean, isn't there a new way to see socialism? Meaning, some of these people I think were wanting to have like a more kind of a moderate socialism. And he said, what I mean by socialism is communism. He will die a Marxist-Leninist, and someone who proved it by winning state power in a situation where nobody dreamed that was possible. I mean, he's a singular figure in history.
What about Raul, though?
Raul is his side-by-side brother. I mean, I think they think very much alike. But it's not a brother, it's not even Fidel anymore. It's a country that's gone through 50 years of experience. And I have to tell you, there's been predictions for its fall since 1959, and especially since 1989, 1990, 1991, when all of Eastern Europe fell. And the reason Cuba survived is because of the party. The Communist Party of Cuba, you know, it's very hard to join the party. You cannot, it's not like other parties where there was privilege built in or whatever. It's a very hard party to join. Basically, it's about 10% of the population, but your neighbors have to approve of your membership. Your co-workers who are not party members have to approve of you joining the Communist Party. So that means that the workers and the neighbors, their expectation is one, a good fighter? Is he good to his family? Is he a good worker? And so it's very interesting that the whole population has a say in who becomes a member. And here's another example. As part of my document that's going to be published on our website, there are two very famous Cubans who were just recently removed from the party and from foreign ministry, and the second vice president of the revolution. And that is a very good sign. Why? Because Carlos Laje, who was actually the second vice president of this Council of State, I don't know if you guys know who he was, but he's in his 50s, and he was highly regarded. I had great admiration for him for many years. He was an economist. He's actually a trained doctor. He was very, very high up. Many people thought he might end up being someday president. And Felipe Perez Roque, who was the foreign minister. He was the youngest foreign minister ever, under 40 years old. He was like 36 years old. But they were removed because they got caught in a entrapment by the Spanish intelligence services. It's a long story, but basically right after Obama's election, the second in command of Spain's intelligence came into Cuba. And there was a whole operation to entrap them making comments against their leadership, these two men, which they fell for. And they were very, very revolutionary, but they got caught up in privilege. Privilege. It happens, They go to parties, they go here and there, they started making comments. And they were filmed videotaped by the Spanish intelligence. And they revealed who the next president and vice president was going to be of the country before it was made public. That's a no-no. Why? Because the US CIA has always tried to track who are the likely successors for the purpose of assassination. And they've tried to assassinate Fidel 600 times. Cuba has to protect itself against these attacks. Well, these men were removed. And even though they were very, very high up, there's nobody who can exist in a privileged situation for long in that party.
They were in the what, though?
Let me tell you something. They were in the party. They were highly regarded. They did something that merited their being removed from the party. And when you have someone that high up who the party says no more, I think that's a very good sign. And not only that, every member of the Communist Party was brought into meetings to watch the hearings that were held exposing what they had done. They didn't commit any crimes. They just had become weakened morally. And I think that's a very strong, healthy sign of a party, of a revolutionary party like Cuba's. And what did it do? What did it do to the Cuban people in the midst of trying to fight this? Any problems that come up, corruption, strengthening the revolution, defending the revolution. You know, corruption is not a specific feature of socialism. It's like a million times more in the capitalist system just by its operation. We should just remember that. But what it did by telling every communist in the country what some of the highly respected people had done, it made everybody realize this is serious. And if it happens to them, we can't accept it from anybody. It's a long story, but you know, you need to go to Cuba, and you need to talk to everybody, and you need to go with an open mind. And you have to understand, you have no idea how hard it is there. You know, a lot of people go there for a nice trip, and they go, man, I want to live there. I go, no, you don't. Americans couldn't live there. You couldn't live with 1/10 of the things. You couldn't live there. But they can. And they're very proud of their country. In the middle of the special period, Fidel spoke to the women, the Women's Federation, and it was their fifth, you know, all the Congress, all the mass organizations have a Congress every 5 years. And he spoke to them and addressed them and said, you all look so beautiful, because you know the women always dress up very nice for these events. And he said, the dresses that you're wearing right now, you may have them in 5 years, you may be wearing the same dresses 10 years from now, because we are in for a very, very severe period. And the women got up and gave him a standing ovation for that comment. And I once sat with a taxi driver. Taxi drivers are the greatest, you know, you get all these kind of stories in any country. And this man said, you know, I'm not a communist, I'm a fidelista. He said, but you name me any president who can tell you that you're going to suffer for who knows how long, and that you stick by his side. And I walked into a that famous biotechnology center that has developed the only medicine right now that's even being tested by U.S. pharmaceutical for a very advanced and dangerous and aggressive brain cancer in children. And it's considered to be the most promising medicine for that kind of illness. And they have a lung cancer vaccine right now that's being used in Vietnam, China, and elsewhere. I mean, they have all kinds of incredible medicine that they're developing. And in 1993, when nobody was hardly eating at all, and this is in one of my other videos, these young scientists were developing all kinds of medicine and scientific development. No special pay. And this man was so skinny, it was shocking. He looked like a skeleton, a young scientist. And I knew he was skinny because he was eating. And he could have become a rich person in any other country. But he was there for his people. And they got through it. And he gained weight, you know, and they're all doing better now, but they are going to go through another severe test. And I think it's going to be very hard for them. The 500,000 people, they're not happy about it. But I highly doubt that there's going to be rebellions in Cuba. Because the people know that they have to work. I'm confident that
cause rebellion at all from these people?
You know, if you keep 500,000 people working in inflated workplaces with money that has no value, you know, if you have to print money to keep them employed, you're going to have to eliminate healthcare. I mean, that's really the thing. You're going to eliminate one thing or another. You're going to eliminate one thing or another. In the special period when they were about to engage in all this, in 1993, a lot of stuff happened in 1993. And in 1993, they had for the first time direct elections of the national parliament and the provincial parliament. They used to have them nominated from the municipal parliaments. You know, it was a parliamentary system and never direct in the national parliament. And in 1993, in the midst of all the difficulty, they said we're gonna make even more perfect our democracy. And they made the elections direct. And after they elected the national parliament, this is when they had to implement all these economic changes, layoffs for the first time, changes in the workplace, you know, all this kind of stuff that would cause some disruption, but bring money into and make them survive. And the national parliament said, we're gonna cancel our sessions. We're not gonna take these measures out and discuss them in the parliament. We're gonna take them to the people. And for the next several months, they held 83,000 workplace meetings in every workplace, in every school. And they called them workers' parliaments. And they went to the people and said, what should we do with these economic changes? And the people said, we want health. They said, should we keep health care or should we cut it down to save money? And the masses said, keep health care free. But the teachers said, we'll take a wage freeze. And the doctors said, we'll take a wage freeze. And the doctors don't make much money. And the students said, we agree, we want schooling free, but if we make less than the C, we agree to pay for our school books. That was the students' offering. And they voted, get rid of the subsidized rum, because every worker would get a bottle of rum. They got rid of that. Rum is expensive in Cuba. You know, it takes like about 3 weeks' wages to get a bottle of rum. But the workers said, this is what's important to us. And because it was taken to the people, you know, a lot of ultra-leftists, sometimes Trotskyist groups, sometimes, why are you all laughing? Okay, well, I say that just as a you know, talking about the currents in the movement. A lot of times they'll say it's not a work, it's a form of workers' bureaucracy. There's also, no, I hear that a lot. I was in that movement too, you know. But they'll say things. It's not a democracy. It's top down. You know, Fidel brought the revolution. The workers didn't do it. Blah blah blah. I'll tell you something. I haven't ever heard of any example like that. And that's why there were no food riots, no fights. There was one disturbance in the whole time of the special period. And I'm talking, I went
There was no
to
violence either. That part.
There was no violence. There was no electricity. You know, people would have mosquitoes and no electricity at night, and their refrigerators would be destroyed because a power surge destroyed the refrigerator. People had nothing. I remember one time seeing my friends in the morning, and they said, all night, we fanned our baby all night so that the mosquitoes wouldn't bite on her. And it was boiling hot. And you didn't have that because the workers, the people of Cuba know that there's not a capitalist class above them. And they knew that everybody was sacrificing. God was alive, the God that was removed. He riding to work on his bike. He was skinny too. And his mother at one time said, Mijo, you know, when things got better, she said, I want to paint my porch. He said, no, mother, if nobody else can paint their porch, you can't either. Anyway, sorry, I got lots of stories. I'm telling you, you'd be very humbled by going to Cuba. Very humbled.
I'm sure.
I'll be the first to admit that I know very little about Cuban-U.S. relations, but I'd be interested to know what are the motivations of the U.S. officials in their continued blockade. Are they afraid of something? What's going on here? What do I not know?
Yeah.
Or is there not a clear motivation other than some continuation of frustration with Fidel or whatever?
Could someone else answer that, please?
I have a similar question.
Yeah.
What's the relevance of the triumphs of the Cuban Revolution today, and why has the U.S. culturally repressed it so much?
Why what? What has
Why has the U.S. repressed it? The influence of you know,
Oh.
Cuba gaining independence so much.
Yeah. Well, in a very short nutshell, to put it another way, a lot of very well-intentioned, liberal, progressive, a lot of prominent people, they'll say this, they'll go, they're very pro-Cuba, for Cuba's right to live, and they'll go, come on, we trade with communist China, we trade with Vietnam, they're communist countries, why not Cuba? But see, it's the tactical approaches of the U.S. imperialists, depending on the circumstance. They can't blockade China because it's the biggest market in the world for them. They desperately have this economic relation. They may have their economic fights with China, but in the end, they'd like to undo China as well. The 1989 incident, the U.S. really, at some point, will want to break China up. They blockaded Vietnam for many years that people aren't even aware of. They caused great destruction, some say even more than the war, until they finally lifted the blockade partially. But with Cuba, they see Cuba as something that they can just smash. The influence I think Cuba's influence is far greater than Vietnam's in the world, far greater than China's in terms of revolution and hope for Latin America. And I don't mean even just revolutionary overthrow, but starting to break away from the empire's hold in the international fora of Latin America. It's very dangerous for the U.S. The U.S. capitalism has to seek ever more markets and favorable conditions for their export. What are all the free trade agreements for? And if you have Argentina, Venezuela, and a growing number of countries rejecting the NAFTA, the CAFTA, and all those other stupid agreements, it takes them out of the sphere of U.S. capitalism. So what seems to be a, contradiction, like, look, all the hotel companies, the telephone companies, communications, oil companies, they want to trade with Cuba, and all agribusiness, ADM and Monsanto, they want business in Cuba, and they sell to Cuba.
Why do they want, so you're saying all the companies want business?
U.S. corporations, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, speaking for U.S. business, wants the blockade lifted. So what's happening here? Why? Because the imperialist state of the United States, which is far more reaching than any corporation, because corporations will sell sell the rope to hang themselves, They will, they'll do anything to make a buck. They all see that individually their interest in having business in Cuba, they don't want out of it. But the state of this country says, wait a minute, y'all hold off for a while. Soon we will overthrow that revolution. And then not only will Cuba be open to you, but there'll be no more challenge in Latin America. That's really the long vision of it. That's why what seems so illogical and so outrageous continues, even through Obama's administration, but in a more sophisticated way.
Do you think the imperialist wars that are going on in Iraq and Afghanistan play a large role in sort of minimize, their problem with records in Latin America, who we could use to in the 70s and whatnot? So do you think, the fact that U.S. military is so tied up in the Middle East right now that they have to sort of conduct economic warfare throughout Latin America instead of just open wars?
I actually think that the CIA and the National Security Agency and all those agencies are far bigger than even during that time. And I think the U.S. is employing more of this counterinsurgency in Latin America. I'm not saying more than that time, but I think they feel it. If they can't back the right through civilian governments, what are they doing on Honduras? They'll do whatever they have to do. If they can succeed in a right-wing government coming back that can do what they need, they'll be satisfied. Peru, they're satisfied. Panama, they're satisfied. They didn't need a coup there. The Panamanian president, by the way, very right-wing, he announced that he would expel Cuban doctors. And he's going right along with this. So, but in Bolivia, they like to assassinate everyone else. Because the right wing there is so powerful. Central America is a great, great danger. And it's not too hard to do that there. In Guatemala and the right wing is such a fascist movement there.
I feel like, I don't know. It seems like it's like a big game and like, I don't know who's playing for what. That's what I'm trying to.
With Cuba, U.S. Cuba?
I don't know. Well, like the comment about the government, the corporation. To me, like a lot of our government like essentially works for the corporations. So like, why are they sending two different messages? That doesn't really make sense.
When someone else.
I would say that the U.S. establishment is mainly a corporatocracy. However, there are competing factions, and especially the U.S. foreign policy establishment is run by Cold Warriors who, not only do they hate socialism, they hate, they hate FDR. I mean, I would not underestimate, the role of just ideology. And so, corporations may want to trade with Cuba, but, Cuba has just been, the gadfly of the U.S. since the 50s, and so they're just not going to let, this current standoff just end by us saying, okay, we're cool with you guys, because that would be, losing face.
I think he's
That's
right. I think he's
my-
right about that. There's a right wing. I mean, you can't identify everybody who's involved in it, but there's a right wing, which is also the CIA is very much involved. I mean, the CIA basically assassinated Kennedy because he didn't want to destroy Cuba in the Operation Mongoose invasion at this point. The right wing, there is a very hard right, characterized, I think, by the Bush administration and the other Bush administration before him, that wanted to basically do everything they could to destroy Cuba. And the Obama administration, representing the more liberal wing, which wants to also overthrow Cuba, thinks they can do it by engaging with them. If we come in and have trade, we'll open it up. People will start to demand democracy, American style. But it's all for the same objective. And the capitalist state, he's talking about the ideologues. Cuba really stands in the way of just unfettered exploitation of Latin America that they used to enjoy. But each corporation, that's the nature of capitalism. Each corporation just wants to make their own deal. They're not the one. The government runs for them. It's a capitalist country, but they're not the ones who run the government. In other words, they're not the ones who determine foreign policy. Yes.
So, again, just building off what he said, this is a common mistake people have, is they look at the Republican Party and how right-wing it is, and they say, oh, that's the party of big business. And so they look at the Democrats and they say, well, okay, it's terrible, and it's weak, and it's stupid, and it does a really bad job. But that is the workers' party. They just need to grow a spine. But the problem is, this is actually a mistake, just as he was saying. They're both capitalist parties. And one represents, concretely, the Republicans represent finance capital, which, investment firms, investment banks, that sort of thing. They also represent raw mineral exploration, right? Your oil drilling, your mining, etc. And then they also represent your defense spending, your Halliburtons, your Blackwaters, your entire military investment complex. Now, the mistake is to think the Democrats represent the opposite, Instead, just because the banking finance capital is based on capital, Democrats represent a different wing of finance capital, a more long-term invested rather than more short-term invested financial capital. They represent industrial capital, right, the factories, Ford, Chevrolet, etc. And they represent, pharmaceutical capital and medical capital, the big pharmaceutical companies that make millions. So what happens is both of these ultimately want to make as much profit for capitalism as possible in the long term, but they also want to make as much profit for themselves as possible in the immediate term. So what happens is these two factions fight against each other, and they fight against each other, really in a lot of really dirty ways. But the mistake is to think that it's the difference between the workers and the ruling class. Really, it's a fight between Pepsi and Coke. They're both unhealthy. They're both looking to make as much profit off people getting unhealthy as possible. And so this is how it looks like. You might think, well, Obama should have these liberal policies and these really helpful leftist policies. But in fact, they're all playing for the same team. They just disagree on what's best for the team.
Is that about Cuba? It
Well,
seemed like that was just.
She asked, how do you tell who's
Well,
what?
here's the thing, is that we shouldn't just keep looking at U.S.-Cuba policy. What are the politicians doing? What's Congress going to do? What's the president going to do? What's the military going to do? I think people really, especially since the 90s, more and more the polls show that the majority of Americans want to be able to travel. They want the blockade lifted. More states in the South and the Southwest, Midwest are starting to see that it would be beneficial, sadly for their own interest, beneficial for trade. But there's a lot of things that people can do to help educate. And I think, for example, the Pastors for Peace caravans, those had a big effect, a really big effect in opening people's eyes. One thing that really, really made people realize the outrage of Miami was the Elian situation. All of a sudden, the whole country was like, what are these people doing in Miami? But I don't know. The Cuban Five, not a case known. Who was here today to hear about the Cuban Five? Please. I don't know if it was a flyer, but at least if you could sign a petition for them. There's the 5 Cubans who came into Miami in the early 90s when the U.S. was engaging in more terrorism against Cuba, and they infiltrated terrorist organizations to report back and prevent the crimes being carried out against Cuba. And they're in U.S. prisons right now. They're serving 15 years of double life. And that is Cuba's big, big fight. Anybody who goes to Cuba now comes back and says, I saw these men everywhere in the country. And we hope that you can take the time to check it out.
Yeah, we have patents.
Yeah, and read about them, get on the email list. Because I would say that our committee, the National Committee to Free the Cuban Five, has played a big role in explaining their case and bringing it to the public. Not enough, but in a big way. And that's what it takes. Political prisoners get freed by political actions. But also, I'm from the Party for Socialism and Liberation. We're having a tremendous conference. The reason I say it's tremendous, even though it hasn't happened, is we had 2 already in LA. And we're going to have it November 13 and 14 in Los Angeles. We had over 400 people last time. And so I'd like to welcome anybody who might be willing to go to LA. There's cheap fares on Southwest to consider coming to the conference and seeing more of what we're fighting for in this country. Basically, socialist revolution. But we're very happy to be involved with the Cuban Five. And I think that at some point they'll be free. But anyway, does anybody have any more questions? You know that in Cuba, a lot of people think they don't have democracy or elections, but in fact, does anybody know about their elections in Cuba? What?
They have the Poder Popular,
Yeah, Poder Popular, people's power. But
very
it's,
grassroots too.
yeah, very grassroots. You're not allowed to spend any money in the elections. When you run as a candidate, you get one sheet of biography in your neighborhood. It's from 2 to 8 candidates nominated. The party has no role in it. The trade union does. And the biographies are posted, and the neighbors go and see who it is that's running. People from the age of 16 vote. And the participation is like 98% of people vote. And there's no such thing as promising things to your constituents, because that's not how socialism works. You go as a member of the neighborhood, or the district, or the province, and you just work together in the parliaments to figure out how do we resolve the problems.
It's like 50% is not Communist Party either, I think, right?
Yeah, you don't have to be a member of the party.
Is voting required? Or is
No.
so it's optional? They
It's
have
optional.
98%.
But you know, yeah, it's optional. You know, also, union membership is not optional. It is optional. In fact, the leftists of the Cuban labor movement traditionally always fought against compulsory membership, which is interesting, because here we fight for union shops where everybody in the shop has to join the union, protect the union, right? But in Cuba, it's voluntary, and the dues are voluntary. And yet the membership is 97% of the workforce is union.
Sounds like they're doing something right.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, because then they have to really be accountable. They have to really be accountable. But you know, it's not a union that is in contention with the government, because it is workers' power. And so the union plays the role of defending the workers, representing the workers in the workplace. But they also play the role as workers, and the workers, you know, are always having to improve efficiency, increase production, because it benefits people. Sometimes people, like in the bourgeois trade unions here, they'll go, yeah, but Cubans don't have, in a socialist society, they can't strike, they can't go on strike. But if you take the case of Cuba, what would you go on strike for? What do you imagine that you would go on strike for in Cuba?
I don't know, to be counter-revolutionary.
So I mean, really, if you go on strike, it's because you say, well, you know, you don't like the conditions, or you're not getting enough wages and so on. But people are much more conscious to know why it is that wages are a certain way. I once walked into a factory that was producing shirts for export with a small delegation. This was 1994, the heat of the special period. And in that time, there was no fuel, food was scarce, but still, every workplace made lunch for the workers. And we walked in, and we were waiting for the meeting, and we were gonna meet with the party and the administration and the union. And the secretary came out and said, you know, we're sorry if you don't mind waiting, but the party leader and the boss and the union leader, they're all out looking for firewood, because there was no fuel to cook the lunch with. And they went out into the street in urban Havana to look for something to cook the food with. I mean, that's how hard things were. And after a while, we're sitting there, and they came back, and the announcement came over the air, and they said, you know, compañeros, and all the people were sewing. And they said, compañeros, we're sorry to announce there will be no lunch today. There was no firewood. Now, you don't get your lunch. If they go on strike, or say we're walking out, sure, they didn't eat, maybe they didn't eat the next day. But if they stop production on the shirts, that's that much less income for the country. And people know that they are the owners of the production as a socialist country. These are the realities of living in a blockaded and underdeveloped country. Yeah.
So I maintain a thesis, and it goes back to Leninism in the sense that Lenin formulated the state was a weapon for suppression by one class by others, right?
Yeah.
Fidel chain take over, they use the state to get rid of the bourgeoisie with extreme prejudice.
Yeah.
But also,
I like that.
But I guess one of the things that always gets plagued by Leninism is, oh yeah, well the state never withers away, and it's arguable that the state hasn't completely withered in Cuba to the extent that it should.
Of course not.
But do you think that certain elements of it have or been definitely relaxed in comparison to say Soviet Union?
That's a really good question. Yes and no. The state, in terms of a defense, is highly developed, and they have to have it.
Right.
The fact, the Cuban Five are just a symbol of the thousands of men and women who are agents for Cuba all over the world, following terrorists and protecting Cuba against, not just terrorism, but sabotage and espionage. But I would say that the police, for example, there's definitely police, but there's like a world of difference from the U.S. capitalist police. Very humane. I mean, they're firm. You never saw a more organized traffic than in Cuba, and they're very strict. That's the one thing people don't like, is the cops' traffic control. But it's very strict. And you can get ticketed if you run through a yellow light. So people are, that's good. That's actually good. But the enforcement by the police is against theft, against weakening of the socialist economy, and protecting very, very, very minimal resources. So it's actually a lot of that. But, for example, let me just give you another. I like to use examples sometimes because there are the things I see that say, yeah, it's like, it's too bad they have to do that, but they have to do that. And in my last trip for May Day, I was a guest of the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the Peoples. It's the non-governmental friendship society of Cuba. And I stayed at the Protocol House, and I had a driver. Occasionally, they didn't have that much gas. They used to take us everywhere, but this time they said, we don't have much gas. I said, it's fine, I'll buy you gas. And they took me to the airport to go home. And they drove me, there's 3 airport terminals in Cuba. One is for the international flights. And it's a very nice new thing from all over the world. And then there's one for the flights from the U.S. because they're mostly Cubans who come in. And they have to be very careful who comes in. The travel's been greatly relaxed for Cubans coming back home, but they still have a separate terminal. And because I was taken to a terminal where Cubans go, and mostly it's family members bringing their families to the airport so they can fly home or, go visit abroad, they were Cubans. I was taken in a state car to the airport. And the driver waited for me to see if I got my suitcases through before I come out and drive him. And because it was a state car, it was unusual. The police said, why is this state car here taking someone, the police immediately suspected the airport police in these little dinky cars. They're not like cops with all the junk that cops here have, and batons, all this shit. Gas and guns and handcuffs and all that. This police came up and they said, why are you here with a state car? Thinking you are using a state car for personal privilege. You're taking one of your family members home. And they were watching it because they're trying to watch the gas. They're trying to watch the gas. And they're trying to stop people from illegally using the car. And I came out and he said, he's trying to tell them, and they're having a good conversation. They're not giving him a hard time. They're just, you got to show what you're doing here. And he's talking to them and showing his ID. And he used to show his ID. And I came out and I said, I didn't want to interfere. I said, I'm American. He's from ECOP. He's taking me to the airport. It took like half an hour before that got cleared up. But I know why it was. Because they don't want misuse of state goods to protect the economy. So that's an example, like the police is trying to keep corruption and theft from happening. So that, no, the police isn't going to disappear. There was another time, if I could tell you another incident that was just kid who's been beaten by the cops or arrested by the cops or anything like that, knows what the cops are like, would appreciate it, and they often do. This was again, hard times, no buses. Buses were all falling apart. And I was downtown Havana and I see this new bus stopped in the street. And all these people were yelling in the bus, and the police van drove up, and the police came out. And they go to the front door and they're investigating what's going on. So of course I'm like, I wonder what's going on. And there were like 4 police, you know, all leaned in the doorway talking to the bus driver. And all these passengers are shouting. And then all these young guys in the street are like, what's going on? So they all come in and they're all like putting their hands on the shoulders of the cops, leaning in to listen to the conversation. Now what's wrong with this picture? They trust the police, and they usually back off, or you're under arrest, you know? And here, the kids are like, their hands are on the cops and, you know, inside listening to what's going on. And the cops didn't fear the people, and the people didn't fear the cops. And at the end of it, you know, everyone just kind of got away, and I asked the policeman, I said, excuse me, what happened here? And they go, well, this bus is not supposed to carry more than 45 passengers because we have to protect it so it lasts longer. I mean, transit was in a decrepit state. And it was a donated bus, and he said, the bus driver allowed 46 people on the bus. And so when the bus driver realized there were 46 people on the bus, he wouldn't drive anymore. He stopped the bus. He's like, someone's got to get off this bus. And the people like, no one's getting off this bus. Come on, get going, we want to get home. And so the police said, we told him it was his fault. He should have been telling the people. And we said to him, there's pregnant women on this bus. These people are tired, they've been working all day. You got to get your bus going. Next time, don't let more than 45 people get on the bus. And he said, give him a citation, he has to go to the police station. And he lectured by the police chief. And I said, can I interview you? Because I had a video camera. He goes, no, we're military. We're not allowed, you know, because we're not allowed to be interviewed unless we get permission. Want to come with us to the station? Come on, hop in the van with us. And I went to the van with them. And I get this talk by the police, you know, captain or whatever, that the revolution has to protect the people. Blah, blah. You know, it's like, you know, you wouldn't get that here. That, you ask about the state. You ask about the state. And then another time, I'm going by this tourism area, and there's a cop, and he's stand up. And there's a guy, this guy who happened, he stole a wallet from someone, because he's theft, you know. And the cop doesn't have a gun. He's holding onto the guy with his hand on his waist like this. And he's waiting for a car to come and pick them both up. You know. And then I went to a big concert where all these young people were there, and I was told that I could go in if I got told who I was and stuff. And it was just a popular concert. There were kids all leaning against the fence outside. And there's one young police, and he's like, wait a minute, let me go find out about these people who said they were supposed to go in. And he walks away, completely unprotected. Everyone could have jumped over the fence, and no one jumped over the fence. They're waiting for him to come. You know, I mean, like, there's a lot of respect for the police. And I don't say that there's not things that don't happen, but don't let anybody tell you that people are tortured in prison, or tortured by the cops, or brutalized. Because I will say for a fact that there is a principle and a practice and a policy in the very days of the revolution that the Cubans do not tolerate torture or mistreatment. That doesn't mean that there's not an incident that doesn't happen, but the people have a real culture of that. And I've had cops tell me, if that ever happened, that police would be stripped of his rank and just removed. We would not tolerate it. Now, people will complain that they're asked, you know, why are you at this hotel? What are you doing? To protect the tourists. It's to keep hustling from happening, which does occur. There's a lot of hustling. mean it's like rampant, but it happens downtown Havana, in any tourist area. So, I'm sorry, the time is over.
Anybody else have any other questions?
You can answer the questions as you were talking. Yeah, I was kind of wondering your impression from being there so many times. I understand there's like, I don't know, I don't know enough about everything that you're talking about, but you felt a sense of like the respect for the cops and kind of like a community and a kind of this kind of thing. Was there a fear? I mean, are people afraid, or are they just kind of like together, or does it vary like another?
I think what's really interesting in Cuba is there's no fear of, in black families, of kids being shot to death, or being like, gunned down by cops, or even gang warfare. There is none of that. There is none of that. Are people armed? Yes, they're very highly armed, but not in their home. Nobody has a gun in their home. Every Committee on Defense of the Revolution, the president of the CDR neighborhood has the weapons. They have them cached, put away. And they periodically come out for defense practice. And every child from the age of 11 practices marksmanship. Everybody knows where they will be in case of war. I went to a high school once in the countryside, the Lenin School, these high-achieving kids in the country. They live there 5 days a week, and then they come home on the weekend. And this was in the 90s, and all the kids, with bright faces, like, it was really funny because one time I went with this real liberal couple, and they were like, oh my God, these people have guns and they practice, and this is there, but they're not afraid of it. It's not like here, And these kids had fashioned as a school, as high school kids, all these metal pieces, sharp pieces, and they said, we know exactly where we'll be if we're invaded. And if the imperialist comes, we'll use these as weapons. Because not everybody has them. They don't have many guns. But all the weapons are kept out of the homes. That's why they don't have gun violence and shootings. And peace, there's a lot of peace in the country. A lot. We live a lot of stress, that? In poor families, Black, Latino, people of color. There's a lot of stress. If you live in Oakland, California, I don't know how it is in Salt Lake or Utah, but in Oakland, California, it's an epidemic of killings. I had 2 cousins shot to death in separate incidents in LA because of gang violence. Oscar Grant, New Year's Eve in Oakland, cops fucking shoot him, handcuffed. How many thousands of kids? It doesn't happen in Cuba. It doesn't happen. And the interesting thing is, it's hard for Cubans to understand what life is like here. They don't know. Sometimes they think, if I come to America, I'll be able to work real hard and send money back home. But they have no idea it ain't that easy. I once had a friend who said, Gloria, if I make it to the U.S., I can live on $5. And I don't mind making just $5 an hour, because to them that's a lot of money. I said, you have no idea how much it costs to live here. It's hard for us to imagine socialism. You're asking questions. It's very hard to imagine what day-to-day life is like. But it's not easy. Getting food is hard. By the way, in 2008, 2 years ago, they suffered from 3 hurricane grade 4 and 5. 4 and 5 hurricanes, 3, caused $10 billion of damage, completely destroyed 70,000 homes, and damaged 500,000 homes. You guys have no idea how hard it is. It's not like they can go to Home Depot. They can't even go to a state. They can't go to anything to buy a piece of wood.
Almost no one died too, right?
No, nobody died. Well, I think 4 people died in all 3 hurricanes because some people refused to leave. And I was in the evacuation of Hurricane Gustav, the 5 that hit the southern part of the island. It was quite amazing to see. Paloma. I was in Gustav in Baton Rouge when it hit. But, you know, at one point, just to show you how severe it is, they had no roofing. The people were like, where do we go? They were sleeping in schools. No prospects for rebuilding easily. And the government asked Bush, please let us purchase construction materials from the U.S. for 6 months. It's all we ask. You can keep the blockade in place, but let us buy from the southern states building materials. No. So you know what Cuba did? They called on the people. They said, everybody turn in all the paper and cardboard that you can in your homes. Let's recycle. Because they do recycle business. Collected everything you can of cardboard and paper. And they made roofs from recycled paper. Just to have something on the roof. You know? And what a great thing it would have been if the movement was strong enough in this country that could have like demanded on behalf of the Cuban people, let them buy construction material. You know, I mean, it really, if it were big enough, it could go to all these stores and say, hey, you could benefit from this, you know, for your own damn self-interest. But there's not much of a movement here. And anyway, that's why in 1992, when they were suffering so much, that when the caravan, this little caravan of 100 people, I was on it, and we broke the blockade and got busted at the border in Mexico, and we finally made it to Cuba, we were like the biggest heroes they could ever imagine. To them, that was the biggest thing that had ever happened. And that's why I went to Cuba so much. I went on the caravan, they needed insulin, they had no insulin, and they made a plea to the world, and I made a bunch of phone calls, and Eli Lilly said, we'll give you $1 million worth of insulin. I mean, that was amazing. I was like, wow. And then they said, actually, we have $2 million, we'll give it to you. Just ship it there. So we got a license, this was 1994, and we took it on several plane flights from Miami.
You spearheaded that?
I organized it, yeah. I mean, just from a phone call, just it was a lucky phone call. But it was funny because Eli Lilly, that medicine was going to become within 6 months expiration in about 4 months. So after 6 months, it would be no good. They couldn't give it to anybody legally. And they thought, well, if we go to Cuba with them, maybe we can start up some business once the blockade is lifted. And so the executives went with us, and I got the license. You know, we flew from Miami, and there was the condition was that this doctor had to go with us. He was Cuban American. He was very right wing, young man, plastic surgeon. Talk about privilege. Grew up in Miami, born in Cuba, but grew up in Miami. And I was arranging his travel, and Ramsey Clark, and a couple of other people, and the executives. And I said something about Fidel Castro, this doctor, and he said, you know, I don't want to hear about Fidel Castro. He's a Hitler. I'm only going for humanitarian assistance. I'm only going for delivering the medicine. I don't want to hear about politics. He hadn't been to Cuba since he was like 2 years old. The minute we landed, his whole life changed. I couldn't believe this. And after a day, we were on the beach in the hotel, the Copacabana, and we were on the beach, and the Cubans said to us, there's a baby that's just, heart's been operated on, it's a few days old, and it needs special medicine. We don't have it. Is there any way that you guys can help us? So Juan Padilla, this doctor, he, you know, in those days it was big cell phones. He's got this big cell phone. God, and he's calling Miami, and he said, Jorge, to his Cuban doctor friend, he said, listen, on the next flight, send this medicine, this baby needs it. He said, Jorge, you would believe Cuba. He said, you know, I'm a Republican. He goes, hell, I'm a fascist. He said that. He said, but Jorge, Cuba's great. They lied to us all our lives, man. You gotta come here. You gotta come here. And I'll never forget that. This has been an experience of many people. And he went back 6 times with medical equipment. He did operations on people to restore, any, facial problems. And he died old black 50 Chevy, whatever. And the guy says, yeah, I want to go to America. And he says, me too. You have no idea what's going on. It's not like you think. And like I said, he went back 6 times. And we took the medicine, and it was enough for 57,000 diabetics for 1 month. Anyway, guys, please sign the petition for the 5. We'll keep you in touch on the news about them. If you see in the subject head, Free the Cuban 5, you won't get more than 1 or 2 a month, I promise. You all ought to think about sending a note to the 5 and telling them that you did this event. They would be thrilled. Can we have a picture?
Absolutely, yes.
Can someone take a picture of us in a circle from here or something?
I already got a couple pictures inside the circle.
Maybe it might be worthwhile just, I know it's late, no one wants to do it, but maybe it might be worth